Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 3 of my 5th generation recap series, or retrospective, whatever you want to call it. Now part 1, I highly recommend you see before watching this. That's of course about the generation as a whole. Part 2 was about the Commodore Amiga CD32. And part 3 is about our friend, the 3DO. Now before I actually start talking about the 3DO, I do need to address a point that unfortunately I'm going to have to address at the beginning of most of these videos, which is that, much like you, I too think of the 5th generation as the N64, the PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn. You know, that's where the nostalgia is, that's where the memories are, that's where we all just process the 5th generation, that's where we all think about it. But the reality is, like these consoles, hate these consoles, whatever you feel about them, these were part of that generation. They kicked off and passed the baton very quickly, and they weren't around for very long, but they were there. And I feel they're worth acknowledging, even if some people like to say they're in the 4th generation. Sorry, they're not. The facts are the facts. They started with the FM Towns Marty in Japan. That was the first one. On the Amiga CD32, which I already talked about. And then third, you get to this one. A really weird and totally misunderstood game console. Now, people commonly think of when they think of the 3DO, they're like, oh, that's Panasonic's crappy machine. It was really expensive. It has no good games, and it's got a lot of porn on it. That's what people tend to associate the 3DO with. What I'm here to tell you, I'm not going to defend the 3DO and say like, oh, it's some great machine you've just never heard of. What I will tell you though is that it is horrendously misunderstood. The first thing I need to address is this concept that Panasonic made it. Because we all associate this one right here, the FZ1, as the 3DO. It's actually not. Panasonic was just one of the engineering companies that worked on it. So this is where it gets fascinating. Because of all those early consoles in the 5th generation, you know, like the Amiga CD32 and others to come, there were a lot of companies that, former electronics companies, or, well, some are former now, but, you know, they were relevant at the time, computer companies, former video game companies, a lot of them looked at the 4th generation and said, wow, Sega just kicked some ass. What they had proved was that you don't need to be named Nintendo in order to win in the console market. You can actually kick ass and make a profit. So somebody said, you know, why not us? Why don't we try it? We can do that. We can make a console. We can poke a hole through, and we can be the third guy. We can kick some ass. Now, obviously, that did happen. You know, eventually, Sony entered, an electronics company. They went in with a console, made it work, and we have the PlayStation. But all these console companies, or all these companies that eventually made consoles, had different little strategies and ideas. Now, the 3DO to me is the most fascinating one. It's not necessarily the best one or even a good one, but it's a fascinating strategy that they employed to try to become relevant in console gaming.
Before we get into this, I gotta issue a huge disclaimer here. The story I'm going to tell you, which I've read multiple times, I've seen other people talk about it, I cannot actually confirm. I have not found anything I would say is 100% proof this is actually true. So in other words, enjoy the story I'm going to tell you, but take it with a grain of salt because it could end up being total bullshit, and I'll be the first to admit it. It's just what I've heard multiple times.
Basically what happened was 3DO, which was its own company, which only went defunct a few years ago actually as a third-party developer at that point, they came up with this thing where they said, you know, it's really bullshit that we have to have a Super Nintendo for some games, a Sega Genesis for other games, a TurboGrafx for some games, and a Neo Geo for other games. Why do we have to do that? Why do we do that? Why don't we just make one machine that is just the video game machine? Basically what they tried to do was they tried to adopt the, basically the policy of the movie industry, at least from the technical level. See, when you think about movies, you have like one format at a time. You have right now, Blu-ray, aside from, you know, obviously the digital stuff. You have Blu-ray. Before that, you had DVD. Before that, you had VHS. You know, you obviously have your hiccups in there. You got your Laserdisc, you got your VCD, you had HD DVD. Now, we'll use that example there briefly, HD DVD versus Blu-ray. The market does not tolerate multiple movie formats at the same time. So these guys basically said, why do we tolerate multiple video game formats? What is the sense in that? What if everyone just had the same standard machine for everything, and we just that was video games. That's why there's actually so many versions of these things. You know, we got the Panasonic FZ1, Panasonic FZ10, which I got very recently, and this one, the Gold Star 3DO. Now, this is so recent, I haven't even cleaned it up. This is pretty much a brand new acquisition here. I'm very happy to have it. The logic was, you go to these engineering companies and say, hey, make one of our machine, you can design it however you want, all it has to do is adhere to a certain technical standard, and you're good. Kind of the way, you know, if back in the 90s when these came out, you know, if I owned a VCR by Zenith, my friend owned one by Sony, and my other friend owned one by, you know, JVC, whoever it was, you could have I could take my one VHS tape and bring it to my friend's house, and it didn't matter that the company that made his VCR was different. The thing worked on both. It was the exact same logic with the 3DO. Now try to wrap your mind around that. I'm sure that kind of mind fucked you. It skull fucked me a little bit the first time I had heard that, and I was like, what? Because that's such a weird and bold and crazy idea. But at the time, it made sense. And I haven't seen anybody try to repeat that strategy, save for Valve's kind of trying to do that with the Steam box to a certain extent, but probably not the same extreme that obviously the 3DO went on. And so if this strategy was so good, what happened? Pretty obvious. Sega and Nintendo didn't want any part of it. Now, you had to have them on board, or it was never going to work. But 3DO did their best to entice them by basically saying, look, don't worry about the hardware. We will handle the hardware. All you got to do is make software. Imagine it. You just make profit off the games. You never have to deal with the hardware division again. And everyone has the same console. It works everywhere. And your games will be everywhere at that point. There's no need for all this fighting, which is interesting to think about. It really is, you know. But I mean, people also like to jump on the price of the 3DO, because when this thing came out, this one, it was $700. By today's standards, well over $1,000. Well over $1,000. So people go like, fuck that, that was an expensive piece of shit, there was no way that should have ever worked. Think about it with that model in place though. Would that really have been that expensive if you had this one game console that was the game console that's supposed to last for at least 10 years, if not longer, and every single developer was making games just for that? Suddenly it's not such a bad investment. You know, and then of course, much like DVD players and Blu-ray players, the first ones are always the most expensive. And then, obviously, over time, they reduce the price. Now you can get Blu-ray players at like Walmart for like 89 bucks. Same logic. You would have had the launch ones that were really expensive, and then you would have had the other ones that came along that could do other things, like play VCDs out of the box, you know, whatever. And then you would have had your cheap bargain bin ones, all of which play the same games. That was their plan. In an effort to entice Sega, probably more so, and Nintendo, they actually, and all other developers, they did some crazy shit you would never see anybody do now, which was they basically dropped the developer's fee. Now the developer's fee, if you're not aware, when a company like, say, Activision decides they want to make a game, and for, let's say, the Xbox One, they have to go to Microsoft and say, like, all right, we want to make a game, and Microsoft says, all right, here's a standard form you fill out, and this is, you agree to pay us this much for the right to make a game for our console. That's how that works. And then, of course, they strike up royalty deals and all that kind of shit. But basically, you pay a console manufacturer to make games for their console. Makes sense. 3DO basically said, anybody wants to make a game, anybody wants to make a game, there's no development fee, or at least virtually no development fee. It was very low. Because they knew that if the console was successful, they would eventually be able to start charging, and you'd have no choice because it was the only game in town. It's kind of a monopoly logic, but it would have worked in theory. But obviously as a result of that, you actually had a lot of game companies. There was no attempt at quality control. So you had a lot of companies that were making a bunch of weird shit, a lot of really bad games, obviously. And you also had a lot of, the porn industry was actually one of the biggest supporters of the 3DO. They made a lot of really weird pornographic games for the 3DO that aren't even games. You know, they're literally porno movies, and you can like, you know, sometimes you can flip an image, you know, like, there's no real interactivity. Things like the Coven, you know, which I actually did a video on my other channel, Game Society Pimps. We played the Coven. It was hilarious. But, yeah, I mean, that was kind of their plan going in. And I think that could have worked. It could have worked. But again, you would have had to have Sega and Nintendo on board, at least Sega. See, the thing is, while we all shit on the 3DO for having no real games, they did have one big backer, and that was EA. EA was really behind the concept of the 3DO. In fact, to some extent, one could argue they actually led the way. They were really big supporters of it. And I'm sure EA, as a third-party developer, would have loved to have just had this one console. All they got to do is make games for, and that's just the standard thing, and they never have to worry about multiplats. And I still think, while I obviously love Sega, and I'm glad that they didn't do that, because I love them for their hardware, I do think that they could have enticed Sega. I think that would have been possible. I think it would have been possible to tell them, like, look, the Genesis has been out for 4 years. 5 years if you include the Japanese launch of the Mega Drive. It's been out for a while. You're gearing up. At that point, they're gearing up for the Saturn and the 32X, because Sega had horrible internal communication. They didn't even know really what direction to go. I think it would have been possible to convince them, like, look, you just bow out gracefully with the Genesis and just start making games for this. You don't have to worry about hardware anymore. They obviously didn't do that, but I think it would have been possible. And if they had done that, then I'm sure EA would have fully committed to the point where they were like, we're not doing anything for Nintendo. And you probably would have had a lot of other developers be like, look, Sega's on board, EA's on board, fuck it, let's do it. It would have been possible. Then you could have had almost what we have now, where the Wii U pretty much has to go it alone with Nintendo only, and then everyone else develops for the other stuff. You could have had that in 1993. That could have been a thing. Not saying it should have been, just saying it was possible. If you had Nintendo on board as well, it's a wrap. You would never have had another type of game console, except for maybe 3DO's immediate successor, when they decided 10, 15 years later, all right, it's time to update the hardware. Then you would have had a new one. And I'm sure a lot of people out there will be like, no, the PlayStation. The PlayStation would have come in and would have just kicked ass. I'll tell you right now, if that shit had gone down, if Sega and Nintendo had joined up and made this, scheme work, the PlayStation would not have had a fucking shot in hell. The reason the PlayStation worked was just because all of those developers, all those hardware manufacturers, like I said, man, they were all looking to get in. Somebody was going to poke a hole and somebody was going to do it. And Sony just got lucky. What they got was Sega had made a console called the Saturn in which it was almost impossible to program for. And Nintendo made a console, the N64, that used cartridges and pissed off all the developers. Whereas Sony made a cheap console that used CDs, was easy to program for, and it was out there. They just got lucky with timing. And I really think that if all the developers hadn't jumped ship when they did from Nintendo and Sega to Sony, they would have just stayed with the 3DO if Sega and Nintendo had stayed there. I mean, nobody really knows, because that obviously didn't happen. Maybe in a parallel universe somewhere it did, but it is interesting to think about, isn't it? Just that could have been gaming history. It could have just been the 3DO, and that's it. And everything else, nothing else is ever going to come about. It was actually very possible. Now, to talk about some more of the actual console aspects itself, obviously it has multiple designs, so really pick your poison, which one you like the best. I actually personally have no preference. I think they're all fine. They all do exactly what they're supposed to do. It's an interesting console because they were so interested in just letting people play games on these things. There isn't even any attempted copy protection. Now, that's largely because in the early 90s, the idea of someone burning their own CD was as futuristic as a fucking lightsaber. But, it's there. It's interesting that you can do that. It's also, by the way, the last generation, other than the Dreamcast and the 6th generation, where you could do that, where you could just take a console home, and if you wanted to, you could just burn some discs and play them right away. But, of course, they didn't know that was going to be the case. But also, they so wanted people to play games on this, they didn't even include region coding at all. Like, if you were in the US and the game only came out in Japan, fucking import it. It's fine. That's fine. Bring it over. It'll work. No problem. No problem. You can play that shit. Okay. And that's pretty cool. They really made every concerted effort to allow people to play this thing and just try to get it in as many homes as possible, because that was the only way it was going to work. Is you needed people to buy it, and you needed big companies to support it, and it just never really got off the ground. Now, is that good or is that bad? I don't know, but that's the case. Now, I got a bunch of games for this thing, all legitimate, despite the fact they're in binders. I'll show you some of them here. Just, legitimate discs, I swear to you. You could burn your games. I have done it before, but these are all legitimate games. The thing is, though, there aren't a whole lot of games that are actually really worth playing on it. A lot of them are multiplats, and they're fine multiplats, but they're multiplats, so you can get them other places. They're not a whole lot of exclusives, and the exclusives you do get, if you can, they're console exclusives, but sometimes you get, PC versions, of course. But there are a lot of FMV games. If you like the Sega CD, Vampire Mike Sega CD universe, you'd probably be like the most excited person to get a 3DO if you don't already have one. It's kind of the Sega CD on crack.
Interestingly, the 3DO gave us the Madden and Need for Speed series.
And it had a lot of potential. We'll never fully know what its graphical potential really was, because it obviously was never fully utilized because it just wasn't around that long. But yeah, you know, who knows? Who knows how much ass it could have theoretically kicked with the right people behind it. People like to talk about the controller. I'm going to show you that real quick. This is a Gold Star one, the one that came with this, and this is the Panasonic one, the one that came with both the FC1 and the FC10. The controller itself is, you know, fine. It's got some neat ideas on it. You know, it's got a volume jack, it's got a headphone jack. It kind of looks a lot like a cross between the Genesis controller and the Super Nintendo controller. It makes a lot of sense for the time that it came out in. But the thing that people always get on about this console for is something that it makes sense to complain about, but at the same time there's also a reason for it. The console only has one controller port, which everyone just kind of goes, what the hell is that all about? Now, as I told you before, the goal of this console was to be standardized across the board and to be future-proofed. That was why they only put one controller port on it, because they said, okay, you know, you could only ever need one controller, or if your friends want to come over and play, here's our plan. They actually built a controller port right into every controller. So the idea was that you would daisy chain from one controller to the next if you wanted another one, because they could not predict how many controllers a game was going to want to limit to. So for example, you had the Genesis, right? It had 2 controller ports. You had the Super Nintendo, it had 2 controller ports. Unless you use things like multi-taps, or in the case of the Genesis, you know, one of those J cards, unless you had something like that, you were going to be limited to basically 2 controllers. But if you're making this console that's supposed to last like 10, 20 years maybe even, we don't know. It's laughable to think about that now, I realize that, but that was the plan. You would want this daisy chaining ability, because what if a developer decided, I want to make a game that supports 10 players? Then you'd have to have the ability to just infinitely daisy chain. I don't know if it would have been able to get enough power for that to work, but you understand my point. They just wanted to future-proof a bit without actually, and also reduce the cost in the console, because, you know, putting in the extra ports is expensive. And if you ever want to get down to that point where you're doing those bargain bin versions, you're going to need to only have one port on it. I'm sure if they could have done wireless, not infrared wireless, I mean like, you know, what we consider wireless now, if that had been possible back then, I'm sure they would have done that instead. So, yeah, man, that's kind of the 3DO. You know, my experience with it was that I never heard of it when it was out. I got one maybe like 10 years ago. I got an FZ1, not this one actually. I got it from a used game store. It was only like 60 bucks, maybe even less. Maybe it was more like 50 or 40. I don't even really remember. Again, it was 10 years ago. Came with a copy of Wolfenstein. I had a fun time with it, but you know, it was nothing special, you know. And over time, I decided I wanted to give it another shot, so that's why I traded some stuff to a friend of mine. He hooked me up with another FC10 and most of these games. Eventually got very lucky and picked this up, and I just got this recently. This was 40 bucks. This was nice to get a hold of, just for the, ooh, it's another weird iteration of the 3DO. Just for that kind of factor. There's, you know, excitement in playing the 3DO behind it. Although it did come with Super Street Fighter 2, which is a really good port of Street Fighter 2. So there are some good games on there, there really are, but there's a lot of shit. And I would say that if you are interested in the 3DO, if that's a console that's ever really enticed you, strike sooner rather than later. They were really cheap for a while, but in recent years they're starting to go up a bit. Now I'm seeing them go around the 200 range, and they're starting to go up more than that. So if the console has ever interested you, strike soon, because it's not going to get much cheaper, if cheaper ever. You know, that's just my advice to you if you have any personal interest in this console. But in all honesty, I can't necessarily claim I recommend it either. I mean, you have to like a certain type of cheesy genre. Again, if you really like the Sega CD, you'd really like the 3DO. It's got some good, it legitimately has some, you know, good games on it, but like I said before, man, most of them are ports. So it's another weird entrance into console history and to this generation, especially for the story behind it. You know, we obviously, I'm sure every single one of you out there is like, that's a fucking retarded model. I like having just, you know, I like consoles, or that maybe not. Maybe you're one of the people, I know a lot of PC gamers are kind of like this, where you just wish there was no such thing as consoles and there was no such thing as exclusives and everything was available for your one format. So maybe you would have loved the 3DO. I'm not saying that's the case with all PC gamers, by the way. You know, but my point is, Who knows if that would have been good or bad for the industry? I certainly don't presume to know, but it would have been very interesting to see gaming go in that direction. So, yeah, guys. I mean, that's really pretty much it. That's everything I got to say on the 3DO. If I had had one growing up, I might have more of an interesting story for you. But really, all that happened is that I was in high school, and I think I was like 16 or something at that point. And I was just like walking to a game store, guys, got a 3DO. Oh, I've never had a 3DO. I'm gonna buy that 3DO. Played the 3DO. Wolfenstein was okay. Didn't really do anything else with it. You know, I have no real nostalgic memories of it. You know, it's cool because at the time it doubled as, it still does obviously function as a CD player, which obviously means very little now, but in '93 that added some value to it. I know you can add VCD support to it. I'm sure had it lasted longer, you would have had ones that had built-in VCD support. Hell, maybe we would have reached a point where it had DVD support. We don't know. But I doubt it. But there you go, guys. That really is pretty much everything. So yeah, the only other thing really worth noting is that it never had a proprietary output. And what I mean by that is, you know, you look at the back of your Genesis or your SNES or whatever, even hell, you know, a lot of consoles really up until Wii had non-standardized ports on the back, so you had to use their official brand thing or maybe third-party versions to plug it into your TV. The 3DO, out of the box, just had RF, composite, and S-Video. It never had its own proprietary format. That way you could grab your own cables and just use them that way, which is pretty nice. Now, personally, I would have preferred it had RGB SCART support, but of course, since we don't have that in North America, I don't totally blame them. So, personally, I always use the S-Video. But, yeah, there you go. That is the 3DO, and I know I said that like 3 times now, but thank you guys for watching part 3 of this series. Please stay tuned to part 4, which will actually be the Atari Jaguar. So that's it for now. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all later.